The moment Frances Ford collapsed in the middle of Calico Creek's Main Street, the summer of 1882 became the summer she would remember for the rest of her life, not for the heat that had driven her to her knees, but for the pair of worn leather boots that were the last thing she saw before the world went dark. She had arrived in Calico Creek, Texas, 3 days before that sweltering Tuesday in July, stepping off the stagecoach with nothing but a battered leather trunk, a small reticule, and a letter of recommendation from the schoolteacher's college in St. Louis that had trained her. The letter was crisp and official, but it could not have prepared her for the raw, unpolished reality of a cattle town that smelled of horse sweat, sawdust, and something else entirely that she had chosen not to identify too closely. Calico Creek was the kind of place that chewed up soft things and spit out the remnants, but Frances Ford was not as soft as she appeared. She was 24 years old. With dark chestnut hair, she kept pinned in a practical bun that never quite tamed all the curls that sprang loose at her temples. Her eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that changed color depending on the light, darker when she was upset, almost silver when she laughed, which was more often than people expected given the seriousness with which she approached most things. She was not tall, standing perhaps 5 feet 4 inches in her boots, and she was slender in the way of someone who had worked hard her whole life, not the fragile slenderness of a woman who had been kept indoors. She had grown up in Missouri, in a household that had known better days before the war had taken her father and left her mother to manage 4 children on very little. Frances had learned early that dignity cost nothing and education was the only inheritance that could not be stolen. She had applied for the teaching position in Calico Creek because it was the only one available within 500 miles that offered both a wage and a roof over her head. The town had a schoolhouse, according to the advertisement, and a community of families who wished their children educated. What the advertisement had not mentioned was that the previous teacher had departed under circumstances that no one in town seemed willing to discuss in full, that the schoolhouse roof leaked in 3 places, and that the boarding house where she was meant to lodge was run by a woman named Mrs. Hattie Dunmore, who served excellent beans, but kept the curtains perpetually closed against the sun, as though she had a personal quarrel with daylight. None of that had defeated Frances. She had patched what she could patch, made lists of what needed fixing, and on her 3rd morning in Calico Creek, she had walked the length of the main street with the intention of visiting the general store for chalk and a new slate board, because the one in the classroom had been cracked clean in half. The sun in Calico Creek in July was not like Missouri sun. It was something of a different animal entirely, pressing down on the back of her neck like a hot iron, shimmering up from the dust of the street in visible waves that made the whole town look like something dreamed at the edge of consciousness. Frances had not eaten breakfast that morning because Mrs. Dunmore's beans had disagreed with her the night before, and she had been too proud and too stubborn to mention it. She had drunk half a cup of coffee, laced up her boots, and told herself she would be fine. She was not fine. The general store was at the far end of the street, past the saloon and the livery stable and the telegraph office, and by the time she was 3/4 of the way there, the edges of her vision had begun to shimmer in a way that had nothing to do with the heat rising off the ground. She stopped walking. She put one hand on the post of a hitching rail. She thought with the particular clarity that sometimes comes in the moments just before a person loses consciousness that she had made a significant error in judgment this morning, and that she was going to have to rectify it immediately. She did not get the chance. The world tilted. The hitching rail slipped from her grasp. The dust of the street came up very fast to meet her, and Frances Ford fainted dead away in the middle of Calico Creek's Main Street, crumpling neatly at the feet of a man who had been standing at the hitching rail on the opposite side, untying his horse. Milton Townsend moved before the thought had fully formed itself in his mind, which was how he did most things that mattered. He was the kind of man who had learned to trust his body's instincts before his brain had time to reason him out of them, and his body had been watching the woman in the green dress walk down the street, with the particular focused determination of someone trying very hard not to show that something was wrong. He had noticed her 3 days ago when she arrived on the stagecoach, had registered her the way a man registers a change in the weather, with attention and interest and a certain wariness about what might come next. He had not spoken to her. He was not, generally speaking, a man who moved quickly toward things he did not understand, but he moved quickly now. He caught her before she hit the ground, which was something he was never entirely sure was true in the retelling, because the whole thing happened in the space of about 2 seconds, and his memory of it was less a sequence of events than a single impression. The weight of her against his arms, lighter than he expected, the smell of lavender soap and the heat of the sun on the back of his neck, and the strange quiet that descended over the immediate vicinity as 3 or 4 passers-by stopped to stare. "Someone get the doctor," he said, not loudly, but with the particular quality of voice that makes people obey without needing to be told twice. He had not always had that quality. He had worked very hard to develop it, in the years after his father's ranch had burned and he had found himself, at the age of 20, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a horse that was not technically his. He was 31 now, and he owned the largest cattle spread in 3 counties, which was either proof that hard work and stubbornness could accomplish anything, or proof that the universe sometimes compensated for early cruelty with later generosity. He had not made up his mind which. He carried Frances Ford out of the street and into the shade of the general store's awning, and he lowered her to the bench that old Ambrose Pickering kept there for customers who needed a sit-down. She was as pale as new linen, and there was a small cut on her palm from where she had grazed the edge of the hitching rail on the way down. He took off his hat and used it to fan her face, which was not a dignified thing to do with a good hat, but dignity had seemed like the wrong priority. She came around slowly, the color returning to her face in stages, a faint flush spreading from her throat upward. Her eyes opened, focused, struggled to make sense of what they were seeing, and then, in the way of a woman who had been unconscious and was not entirely sure yet what was real, she stared up at him for a long, unguarded moment before any defenses came back online. Her eyes, he noticed, were a remarkable color. "You fainted," he told her, because someone had to say it and he had not yet thought of anything more useful. "I am aware," she said, with a crispness that surprised him given that she had been unconscious 11 seconds ago. She tried to sit up straighter and he steadied her with one hand, careful not to presume more than the situation required. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. There was a pause that was itself an answer. "I thought as much," he said. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a piece of hard tack wrapped in cloth, which was not the most elegant thing he had ever offered a woman, but it was what he had. "Eat that, slowly." She looked at the hard tack as though it were both an insult and a salvation. She took it. She ate it slowly as instructed, and he kept fanning her with his hat and said nothing, which was one of the things he did best. "Doctor." Elias Croft arrived from his office down the street in the breathless, slightly disheveled manner of a man who had been doing something else when summoned, which in Elias Croft's case was almost certainly reading, because he read the way other men drank. He was 60 years old and had seen everything that a frontier doctor sees, which is a great deal more than people who have not lived in frontier towns generally imagine. He checked Frances's pulse, looked at her eyes, asked her 3 questions, and then turned to Milton with the expression of a man confirming a diagnosis he had already made. "Heat and hunger," Elias said. "Nothing that a meal and shade won't fix. Keep her out of the sun for the rest of the day." "I have things to do," Frances said. "Ma'am, with respect, your things will still need doing tomorrow," Milton said. "The heat won't be any kinder about it." She looked at him. He looked at her. It was the first time they had truly looked at each other, which was different from the way he had been watching her for the past 3 days from across the street, and the way she had noticed him without intending to. The broad-shouldered man with the bay horse, and the unhurried way of moving through the world that suggested he had never once been in a hurry because the world was his to take at his own pace. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said, with a formality that seemed somewhat at odds with the fact that she was sitting on a bench having just been caught mid-faint by the man across from her. "Milton Townsend," he said. He did not offer his hand because her hands were in her lap and it felt presumptuous. "I have the rocking tea spread about 8 miles east." "Francis Ford," she said. "I'm the new schoolteacher." "I know," he said. She raised an eyebrow. He did not elaborate. Elias Croft, who had witnessed a fair amount of human behavior in his 60 years and recognized the specific chemistry of this moment, made a small sound that could have been a cough and excused himself on the grounds of having other patients. Milton Townsend walked Francis Ford to Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house that morning, carrying her leather satchel because she had dropped it when she fell and had not noticed she was not carrying it. He said very little on the walk back, which suited her, because she was occupied with the dual task of recovering her equilibrium and managing the mortification of having fainted in the public street of a town where she was trying to establish herself as a person of competence and reliability. "People will talk," she said, as they turned onto the side street where the boarding house sat. "People in Calico Creek talk about everything," he said. "They'll find something else to talk about by tomorrow." "You're very certain of that?" "I've lived in this area most of my life. I know how fast news travels in a town this size and how fast it's forgotten." He paused. "Barring anything truly spectacular, do you consider fainting in the street spectacular?" "Less spectacular than some things I've seen." She almost smiled. It was a very small almost, and she caught it before it fully formed, but he saw it anyway because he was paying close attention. At the door of the boarding house, she turned and took her satchel from him with a quiet thank you that she meant more than she allowed to show. He nodded, put his hat back on his head, and walked back toward the main street. She stood in the doorway and watched him go for exactly 3 seconds before she stepped inside and closed the door, which was 3 seconds longer than she intended, and 1 second more than she would have admitted to anyone. The following weeks unfolded in the way of a Texas summer, with a relentless heat that baked the ground to hardpan and turned the horizon into a shimmer of light and distance that could make a person feel very small. Frances threw herself into the schoolroom with the focused energy of someone who has found the thing they are meant to be doing. She fixed the roof with the help of 2 fathers from the community who arrived one Saturday morning with lumber and goodwill, which she had not expected, and which moved her more than she showed. She scrubbed the schoolhouse floor, hung maps on the wall that she had brought in a roll from St. Louis, organized the children into levels by ability rather than age, because it was clear that the previous system had left several of the older children unable to read properly, which was a situation she considered both unjust and correctable. The children of Calico Creek were, as children everywhere tend to be, a mixture of the marvelous and the maddening. There were 14 of them, ranging from 6 to 14 years of age, and among them were the 2 Hargrove boys, who could not sit still for longer than 4 minutes. A girl named Ida who was 12 and read with a sophistication that suggested she had been doing it all her life, and a quiet boy named Thomas who was 8, and who Frances had identified within the first week as someone who would become remarkable if someone paid attention to him. She paid attention to all of them. She was strict and she was fair, and she was occasionally funny in a dry, unexpected way that startled the children into delight before they knew what was happening. By the end of the 2nd week, she had their respect. By the end of the 3rd, she had their affection as well, though several of them would have denied it strenuously if asked. It was through the schoolroom that Milton Townsend came back into her orbit, though he did not arrive directly. He arrived through Thomas. Thomas Reeves was the son of the Rocking T Ranch's head wrangler, a man named Jacob Reeves, who was a good man in the ways that frontier life demanded, and somewhat less accomplished in the ways that a quiet, bookish 8-year-old required. Thomas's mother had died 2 winters ago of pneumonia, and Thomas had retreated into himself afterward in the way of children who are grieving and do not have the words for it. Jacob Reeves had tried his best, but a cattle ranch is not always a place that accommodates the specific kind of quiet that a child like Thomas needed, and the boy had come to school in September already 2 years behind in reading. Frances worked with him every day after the other children had gone home. She stayed an extra hour, sometimes 2, with Thomas sitting across the small table from her, his tongue pressed to the back of his teeth in concentration as he worked through the words on the page. She never made him feel slow. She found the angle at which things made sense to him, and she came at everything from that angle. And by the end of October, she had watched him read an entire paragraph aloud and look up at her with an expression of such pure, surprised pride that she had to look away for a moment to compose herself. Jacob Reeves knew about the extra lessons because Thomas told him, children being entirely unable to keep secrets about good things that happened to them. Jacob, in gratitude and with a practical frontier sense of appropriate payment, sent a side of venison to Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house, which was how Frances ended up eating the finest meal she had had since arriving in Calico Creek, and which was also how she ended up hearing Mrs. Dunmore's thoughts on Jacob Reeves, Thomas, the Rocking T Ranch, and Milton Townsend in one long, comprehensive, and very informative monologue delivered over the dinner table. "Jacob Reeves is a good man," Mrs. Dunmore said, helping herself to more venison. "Solid, hard-working, terrible tragedy about his wife." Milton Townsend took it hard too, in his own way, losing one of his best hands to grief like that, because Jacob was never quite the same after a leaner passed. But Milton kept him on, which tells you something about the man. "It does," Frances agreed, because she was listening carefully. "Milton Townsend is a complicated sort," Mrs. Dunmore continued, which was the way she introduced every subject about which she had strong opinions. "Built that ranch from nothing after his family lost everything. Lost his father young, you know. His mother moved to San Antonio to live with her sister, and Milton just stayed and worked and built. The man has a will like iron, and a heart that he keeps under considerable lock and key, which is a shame because the heart seems to be a good one from what I can tell." "Has he never married?" Frances asked, with a casualness that she was aware was not entirely natural. "Never," Mrs. Dunmore said. "There was a young woman 4 or 5 years back, daughter of the Braddock family over in Ridgeway, but it didn't come to anything. Nobody ever quite knew why. Milton certainly never said." She paused. "He's not the sort who explains himself, as I expect you've noticed." Frances had noticed. She had also noticed, over the weeks since the incident in the street, that Milton Townsend had a habit of appearing in places she happened to be, which might have been coincidence and might not have been. He was at the general store the morning she went to collect the chalk order she had placed. He was at the church social in October, standing near the back with a cup of punch and no apparent intention of talking to anyone, until she walked past and he moved, almost involuntarily it seemed, to intercept her path and ask her how the schoolroom was coming along. She had told him. He had listened with the particular quality of attention that was one of his most unsettling qualities, the sense that what you were saying was the only thing in the world worth listening to just then. They had stood there at that church social for 40 minutes, which was 38 minutes longer than either of them had planned, talking about everything and nothing, about the ranch and the school and the weather, and whether the railroad would reach Calico Creek in the next 5 years, which was a subject of enormous local debate. She had found herself laughing twice, genuinely, not the polite and decorative laugh she sometimes deployed in social situations, but the real laugh that came up from somewhere deeper and surprised her. He had smiled both times, not a full smile, which she suspected he held in reserve for occasions of genuine significance, but something that changed his face enough to suggest the full smile would be worth waiting for. He walked her back to Mrs. Dunmore's that evening. It was half a mile. They walked slowly, and she was very aware of the slight distance he maintained, respectful and deliberate, and she was also to her own quiet interest, aware that she would have closed that distance slightly if she had been the sort of woman who did such things. She was not quite, but the inclination was there. "You should come and see the schoolroom sometime," she said, at the door of the boarding house. "It looks considerably better than it did." "I heard about the roof repairs," he said. "Bill Hargrove said you organized the whole thing." "I organized it and stayed out of the way while men who knew what they were doing executed it," she said. "I find that's usually the most efficient approach." "That's more wisdom than most people twice your age have," he said, and she could tell he meant it, which was more satisfying than a compliment delivered for the purpose of charm. "Good night, Mr. Townsend," she said. "Good night, Miss Ford," he said, and put his hat back on his head and walked away down the street, and she stood in the doorway again for longer than she intended. November came, and with it a change in the air that made Calico Creek a different kind of beautiful, the heat lifting to reveal a sky that went on forever in shades of blue and violet, the mesquite going golden, the mornings carrying a sharpness that made the world feel more real than it had in the haze of summer. Francis had settled into the rhythm of the town by then, in the way of someone who has decided to put down roots and means it, learning which houses had children who needed extra attention, learning the names of the ranching families and the merchant families, and the complicated social web that connected them, learning which of the town's stories were worth understanding, and which were the kind of petty disputes that small communities generate like weather. She was happy in a way that surprised her, because happiness had not been something she had been specifically pursuing. She had been pursuing purpose, which she had found in full measure in the Calico Creek schoolroom. The happiness had arrived alongside the purpose without announcement, like a visitor who installs themselves comfortably before you have had a chance to ask who invited them. She admitted to herself on a clear November evening while grading arithmetic papers by lamplight, thoroughly preoccupied with Milton Townsend, which was a different kind of thing entirely and somewhat less comfortable. He came to see the schoolroom on a Wednesday morning in mid-November, which she had not expected him to actually do, because she had half assumed the invitation at the church social had been the kind of pleasantry that is offered and accepted on both sides without any real intention of being acted upon. But he arrived at 7:30, before the children, and knocked on the door of the schoolhouse with his hat in his hand, and an expression that suggested this had required a specific decision on his part. She showed him the maps and the reading shelf she had organized, the arithmetic problem she had written on the newly repaired slate board, the corner she had set up with a small collection of books that she had brought from St. Louis, and supplemented with donations from 3 families who had books to spare. He walked through the room slowly, looking at everything with the careful attention of a man who does not take things for granted, who knows what it costs to build something and respects the evidence of that cost in whatever form it takes. "Thomas can read now," she told him. "Properly read. He read me a passage from a geography book last week that most 14-year-olds would have struggled with." Something moved across his face at that. "Jacob told me," he said. "I don't think he found the words for how much it meant to him. Thomas is all he has left." "Thomas is going to be extraordinary," she said, and meant it. "If you stay," Milton said, and then seemed to catch himself, as though the sentence had gotten out ahead of his intentions. She looked at him steadily. "I intend to stay," she said. He looked back at her with that same quality of attention, and the schoolroom felt smaller than it was, the morning light coming through the windows and catching the dust in the air and the two of them standing in it. "I'm glad," he said, very quietly, and that was all, but it was enough for now. The children arrived in a clatter of small boots and conversation, and Milton Townsend put his hat on his head and excused himself with a nod that encompassed the room and everything in it. And Frances turned to the slate board and the day's lessons, and told herself firmly that she was a professional woman with responsibilities, and that whatever was happening with Milton Townsend would happen in its own time or it would not, and either way she had 14 children to educate. What was happening with Milton Townsend was something he was managing with considerably less equanimity than she was, though he would never have said so to anyone, because he was not the kind of man who discussed his internal landscape with other people. What he was aware of was that he rode into Calico Creek more often than he had used to, and that his reasons for doing so had shifted from practical errands to something less precisely nameable. He was aware that he had begun timing his arrivals in town with an attention to the schoolroom schedule that was either efficient planning or something considerably more revealing. He was aware that he had told Jacob Reeves, in what he had intended as a casual and general observation, that Thomas's teacher seemed like a woman of exceptional ability, and that Jacob had given him a look that suggested Jacob had understood perfectly well that this was not a casual or general observation at all. Jacob Reeves was 40 years old and had been married for 12 good years before Eleanor died, and he understood things about love and the ways men avoid admitting to it that he had never troubled to share with his employer, partly out of respect, and partly because Milton Townsend was the sort of man who needed to arrive at his own conclusions in his own time. But Jacob was also a man who had learned what was worth saying before it was too late, and so one morning in late November, while they were riding the fence line together in the cold, clear air, he said, without looking at Milton, "Miss Ford seems like a fine woman." "She is," Milton said. "Thomas talks about her like she hung the moon. She's a good teacher, possibly the best this town has ever had." "That's not quite what I meant," Jacob said. There was a silence occupied by the creak of saddle leather and the sound of the horses breathing in the cold air. "I know what you meant," Milton said. "I just think," Jacob said carefully, the way a man speaks when he is trying not to overstep but has decided to step anyway, that Eleanor would have said life is too short to ride around a thing when you could ride toward it instead. Milton did not respond immediately. He rode for a quarter of a mile with his eyes on the middle distance, and then he said, "She would have said exactly that." "She usually was right," Jacob said. "She usually was," Milton agreed. He went into town that Friday afternoon. He found Frances at the general store, selecting thread and a small wooden ruler that was presumably for the schoolroom. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her conduct the small practical business of her life with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything, and felt something settle in his chest that had been uncertain and suspended for weeks. "Miss Ford," he said. She turned. Her expression shifted through several things quickly, surprise and then pleasure and then a more careful neutrality that he recognized as self-management. "Mr. Townsend." "I wonder," he said, "if you would allow me to take you to dinner, properly. Not punch at a church social and not the general store." He paused. "The hotel has a dining room. It's not grand, but the food is decent." She looked at him for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." They had dinner at the Calico Creek Hotel dining room that Friday, and then again the following Friday, and by the third Friday it had become a thing that both of them expected and neither of them had formally established, which was how many important arrangements come to exist. The dinners were long, and the conversation was alive with the particular energy of two people who have found each other genuinely interesting, which is rarer and more valuable than either compatibility or attraction alone, though they also had both of those. She told him about Missouri and about her mother and her 3 younger siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, and about the years after her father died, when she had understood for the first time that the world was not arranged fairly, and that you had to arrange your own portion of it with whatever materials were available. He told her about his father's ranch and the fire that had taken it, about the years of working other men's land and putting money away with a discipline that had required him to want the future more than he wanted the present, which was something he had managed because the future he was building toward was specific and visible in his mind when little else was. They talked about the town and the territory and the railroad question, which was still being debated with no resolution, and about the children in her classroom and the cattle on his ranch and about books, which was a discovery that surprised him because she had not known he read, and the depth and breadth of what he had read in the long, quiet evenings on the ranch was something that rearranged some of her assumptions about him, though she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly which ones. December arrived with a cold front that dropped the temperature 30 degrees in 2 days and brought a light, sharp wind down off the panhandle that rattled the windows of the schoolhouse and made the children reluctant to leave at the end of the day. Francis negotiated with the town council, represented primarily by a man named Garrett Holt, who was the mayor and a reasonable person when approached correctly, for additional firewood for the school. She won, partly through the compelling nature of her argument, and partly because Garrett Holt had a daughter in the schoolroom who had gone from dreading reading aloud to volunteering for it, which was a transformation Garrett attributed entirely to Francis, and was therefore prepared to reward with firewood. She was happy. She was, she thought, the happiest she had been since before her father died, which was a long time ago, and the happiness had a particular quality this winter that it had not had before, which was the quality of something anticipated. Milton Townsend came into her thoughts with a frequency that she no longer attempted to manage, because management had proven ineffective. She thought about the way he listened, the quality of his silences, the very occasional full smile that she had now seen twice, and that was everything she had suspected it would be. She thought about the fact that he had never once been anything but exactly what he appeared to be, which was a quality she had not realized she was looking for until she found it. Christmas in Calico Creek was celebrated with the particular warmth of a community that understands how large the cold and darkness are beyond its borders and compensates accordingly. The church held a service on Christmas Eve that was attended by everyone and featured considerable singing, including a carol that the schoolchildren performed under Francis's direction that went rather better than rehearsals had suggested it would. The Hargrove boys, remarkably, managed to stand still for the full 3 minutes it took, which Francis would later describe as the miracle of the season. After the service, the town gathered in the street around a fire, which was a tradition of several years standing, and people moved from group to group in the cold, clear night, and Francis stood near the fire with a cup of hot cider and felt the specific contentment of a person who belongs somewhere. Milton found her there. As she had been, she would admit only to herself, hoping he would. He stood beside her at the fire, not speaking for a moment, just looking out at the scattered lights of the town and the enormous dark sky above it, which on a clear winter night in Texas was so full of stars it seemed almost extravagant. "Merry Christmas, Miss Ford," he said. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Townsend," she said. "I've been thinking," he said, "that I'd like to stop calling you Miss Ford." She turned to look at him. The firelight was on his face and he was looking at her with an expression that was more open than she had seen from him before, the careful reserve that he usually kept in place slightly lowered, and she understood that this was a significant thing for him, this lowering. "What would you like to call me?" she asked. "Francis," he said, "if you'll allow it." "I think," she said, "that it would be reasonable to allow it, under similar conditions." "Milton," he said, and his name in her own mouth felt like crossing a threshold, which it was. He walked her home under the stars, and at the door of Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house, he stopped and reached into his coat pocket and produced a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of ribbon that looked like it had required some negotiation with a woman in the general store to obtain. He handed it to her and she unwrapped it carefully to find a small, slim volume of poems by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which was not what she expected from a cattle rancher in the Texas Panhandle, and which consequently moved her more than any more predictable gift could have. She looked up at him. He was watching her face. "I noticed you have most of the serious poets on your shelf," he said, "but not this one." "I don't," she said. "I've been wanting it for a long time." "I know," he said. "Elias Croft's wife mentioned it." She laughed. You asked Clara Croft what I was missing from my bookshelf. I asked her what she thought a woman who reads as much as you do might like for Christmas, he said, with the dignity of a man who is not going to be embarrassed about having done something thoughtful. She held the book to her chest for a moment, looking at him in the cold, starlit night, and then she said, "Thank you, Milton. It's the best gift I've received in a very long time." His expression did that thing she had come to recognize, the slight shift that suggested a feeling too large to fully contain. "Good night, Francis," he said. "Good night, Milton," she said, and went inside and sat on the edge of her bed in her coat with the book still in her hands and felt something so complete and warm and right that she had to close her eyes and hold it for a moment before she was ready to set it down. The new year arrived with less ceremony and more practical business, which was the nature of January in a working cattle town. Milton was occupied through the first weeks with the work of the winter ranch, cattle moving sluggishly in the cold, fence lines needing attention after a week of hard wind, the daily complex labor of keeping a large operation functioning in conditions that were not designed for ease. He came into town when he could, which was not as often as either of them would have preferred. But when he came directly, without the ambiguity of the fall, and Francis had begun to understand that this was how he loved things, with a directness that did not announce itself in flowery terms but was absolutely unambiguous in practice. Because she had begun to use that word, at least in the privacy of her own thoughts. Love. She turned it over carefully, the way you turn over a piece of ground to see what it contains, and found that it was the right word and that she was not afraid of it, which was itself a revelation, because she had been afraid of it before, in a vague, unexamined way that had to do with what loving things had cost her family in the past. But what she felt for Milton Townsend did not feel like vulnerability. It felt like solidity, like something she was building toward, rather than something she was falling into. February brought Valentine's Day, which Calico Creek observed in the mild and practical fashion of a community that considered sentiment appropriate in small doses. The children in Francis's schoolroom made paper hearts and delivered them with the solemn gravity of children performing an important ritual, and Francis received, among the children's offerings, a small bunch of winter wildflowers tied with a piece of string that had been left on her desk in the schoolroom with no name attached, which was unnecessary because she knew the handwriting on the folded note that accompanied it, having seen it once on a letter he had brought to the general store for posting. The note said, "I expect these are less impressive than roses, but they were growing near the south fence line this morning, and it seemed wrong to leave them." She pinned the note inside the cover of the Elizabeth Barrett Browning volume, which had become the place where she kept the things worth keeping. Spring arrived gradually, the way it does in Texas, not in a single dramatic gesture, but in a slow accumulation of warmth and green and the return of sounds that the cold had silenced. The children in the schoolroom grew more restless as the season turned, which was a predictable phenomenon that Francis managed with firm patience, and the strategic deployment of outdoor lessons, which was considered somewhat unorthodox but produced excellent results. Thomas Reeves, by April, was reading 2 grade levels above his age, and Francis had quietly written to a teacher's college contact in Austin about a scholarship program for young students of exceptional ability, because she was already thinking about Thomas's future in a time frame beyond the Calico Creek schoolroom, which was what she did for children she believed in. Milton knew about the letter because Jacob had told him, with tears in his eyes that he made no effort to conceal, and Milton had ridden into town the next morning and walked into the schoolroom and said, "Jacob told me about what you did for Thomas." And she had looked up from her desk and something in his expression had made her stand up, and he had crossed the room and taken both her hands in his and held them, just held them. For a moment that contained a great deal that did not need to be said. April turned to May, and May was long and warm and full, and Calico Creek went about its business and Francis and Milton went about theirs, and the people of the town watched the developing thing between them with the interested but affectionate attention of a community that wants its own to be happy, and is fairly certain it is watching something that will end well. There were, of course, complications. There were always complications in a life of any substance. The largest one arrived in early May in the form of a letter from Francis's mother in Missouri, who wrote in the careful, controlled hand of a woman communicating important information while trying not to alarm anyone, to say that she was unwell, and that Francis's younger sister Clara had also taken ill, and that her brothers were doing their best, but that the situation was difficult. Francis read the letter 3 times. She sat with it at the dinner table at Mrs. Dunmore's and was very still for a long time, doing the arithmetic of responsibility versus desire versus reality in the way she had been doing it since she was 12 years old. She had a life here. She had a purpose here. Her family was there and they were ill and she was the eldest, and those things were not easily reconciled. She told Milton about it that evening, which was a Friday and therefore their dinner at the hotel, and she told him plainly because she was not a woman who approached difficult subjects obliquely when there was another option. "I may need to go back to Missouri," she said. "I don't know for how long." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it, the same kind of internal arithmetic. "How ill is your mother?" he asked. "I don't know precisely. My mother is not given to exaggeration, which means if she wrote to tell me, it's serious." "What do you need?" he asked. She looked at him. The question was so simple and so exactly right, not what are you going to do or what about the school, but what do you need, which was a question that put her at the center of the consideration rather than the problem. "I need to think," she said, "and I may need to go." "Then go," he said. "The school will hold. Garrett Holt can arrange for a temporary teacher, and I will be here when you come back." There was something in the way he said those last words that was as close to a declaration as he had yet come, and it moved through her like warm water, and she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers briefly and said, "Thank you." She wrote to her mother and to her brothers the next morning, and she waited 2 weeks for the replies, and they came in a bundle of 3 letters that told her that her mother was improved but not fully recovered, that Clara was better, and that both of her brothers, while grateful for the thought, believed the situation was manageable and were firmly opposed to her leaving a good position in a good town for what they expected to be a temporary difficulty. Her mother's letter, characteristically, said she was fine and that Francis should stay exactly where she was, and that she sounded happy in her letters, happier than she had sounded in years, and that there was nothing more important than that. She read these letters at her desk in the schoolroom after the children had gone home, and when she had read them all she sat for a while with her hands folded and felt the relief and the gratitude, and also the specific feeling of being released from a conflict that had been compressing her chest for 2 weeks. She wrote back to all 3 with detailed affection, sent her mother a package of small useful things, and a bottle of good tonic that Dr. Croft had recommended, and turned her attention back to Calico Creek and the 14 children and the man who had said he would be there. He was there. The spring unfolded warmly and quickly, and Milton found that he was happy in a way that was not complicated, which was unusual for him, because most of the things he valued in his life had come through work, so concentrated that happiness and effort were indistinguishable. But this was different. This was the particular happiness of having found the specific person you did not know you were looking for, and recognizing it when you found it, and not letting the recognition get buried under all the practical reasons for proceeding cautiously. He had the ring by the beginning of May. He had ordered it in March, from a jeweler in San Antonio through correspondence, because there was no proper jeweler in Calico Creek, and he had described what he wanted in a letter that had taken him 4 drafts to write, which was unprecedented because he was not generally a man who struggled with words. He wanted something simple and strong and lasting, not showy, because she was not a woman who valued show, and not plain, because she was not a woman without feeling. The jeweler had sent back a ring of yellow gold with a small oval turquoise stone the color of the Texas sky on a clear day. And when Milton had opened the package in his study at the rocking tee and held it up to the lamp, he had known it was right. He kept it in the breast pocket of his good coat for 2 weeks, which was a longer interval than he had planned, because every time he thought about the specific moment of asking, he found himself wanting more time to be certain, which was his nature, to be certain before committing, and then found himself irritated by the wanting of more time, because he had finally admitted to himself with the exasperated clarity that sometimes comes after a long internal debate. Entirely and irreversibly certain already. Jacob Reeves, who had noticed the ring the one time his employer had taken it out to look at it in the barn, and had quietly replaced it in the coat pocket before Milton noticed him noticing, said nothing. He waited. He thought Alina would have been delighted by the whole business and would have said so at considerable volume, and this made him both sad and grateful in the way that remembering a beloved person often does, which is to say both things at once without contradiction. The evening Milton chose was a Saturday in late May, a night that was warm but not hot, the sky doing the thing it does in the Texas spring where it turns 17 different colors in the half hour between sunset and dark. He drove into town in the buggy rather than riding, which was itself a kind of declaration, because the buggy was for occasions of ceremony, and he came to Mrs. Dunmore's boarding house and knocked on the door and asked, hat in hand, if Frances would like to take a drive before it got dark. She came out in the green dress that she had been wearing the day she fainted in the street, which might have been coincidence and might not have been, and her hair was down from its daytime bun and pinned loosely at the back of her head in the way she wore it in the evenings, and she was more beautiful than he trusted himself to adequately describe, which was fine because he had never been in the business of describing beauty out loud. He helped her up into the buggy and drove them out of town on the East Road, which was the road to the rocking tee, and she sat beside him in the warm evening air and did not ask where they were going because she had learned to trust the direction in which he moved. He took her to the ridge that ran along the northern edge of his property, a low limestone outcropping that looked out over a sweep of land that went all the way to the horizon, the grass moving in the evening breeze, the mesquite scattered across the flats, the creek catching the last of the light in the distance. It was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen, and she stood at the edge of the ridge in the warm air and looked at it for a while without saying anything. He stood beside her. After a moment he said, "I bought this land because of this view. Everything else could be fixed or built or worked, but the view was here already and I wanted to live with it." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her. "Frances," he said, and his voice had that quality of deliberateness that meant he had arrived at something after careful consideration and intended to stay there. He reached into the pocket of his coat and opened his hand, and there was the ring catching the last of the evening light, the turquoise exactly the color of the sky above them in the moment just after sunset. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. Her heart was doing something large and emphatic in her chest. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to say it correctly for approximately 2 months, and I have concluded that there is no correct way, so I am just saying it. I love you, and I would like very much if you will have me to spend the rest of my life with you, here, on this land, in this town, with whatever life we build." She looked at him for a moment that held everything. The long autumn of finding her way into this place and this community and this person, the dinners and the schoolroom and Christmas Eve by the fire and the flowers from the fence line and all the Friday evenings, and the moment in the schoolroom when he had held her hands and the way he said her name and the enormous, quiet, solid, reliable fact of him. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Milton." He put the ring on her finger and his hands were steady, which she noted because her own were not quite steady, and the ring fit as though it had been made for her, which it had. And then he looked up at her, and that was the moment she saw the full smile, entirely, without reservation. And it was exactly what she had suspected and also more. And she laughed out of pure feeling, and he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, there on the ridge in the last light of the day, with the whole of his land stretching out behind them and the stars beginning to show in the darkening sky. They were married in June. The wedding was held at the Calico Creek church on a Saturday morning that was bright and warm without being brutal, which in Texas in June is a genuine gift. The church was full, which surprised Frances, though it perhaps should not have, because she had been in Calico Creek for nearly a year, and in that time had become someone that the town had taken to heart, not just as the teacher who fixed the roof and stayed late with struggling readers, but as a presence that the community had decided it needed and was not willing to give up. She wore a dress that had been made by two women in the congregation who had organized the sewing circle around this specific project without consulting her, presenting her with the finished garment 3 weeks before the wedding with expressions of such combined expectation and uncertainty that she had not been able to say anything except that it was the most beautiful thing she had ever been given, which was true. It was ivory, with small buttons up the back and a simple cut that suited her exactly, and when she stood before the mirror in Mrs. Dunmore's room while the older woman fastened the buttons, she thought that she looked like herself but like the best version, which was what a wedding dress ought to do. The 14 children of the schoolroom attended in their best clothes and sat in 2 rows at the front, which had been Ida's idea, and which Frances had agreed to with the immediate and genuine delight of a woman who understands what is important. Thomas Reeves sat next to his father, and when Frances walked down the aisle past them, Thomas grinned at her with a gap-toothed smile of pure happiness that made her eyes sting. Milton was at the altar in his best suit, which was dark and well-cut and clearly relatively new, and he watched her walk toward him with an expression that contained so much that several people in the congregation looked quickly away as though they had seen something too private to witness, though they looked back almost immediately because they could not help it. This was the moment they had all been watching toward, and it was everything it ought to be. Reverend Clark performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity and some warmth, and when he reached the vows, Milton said his with the same quality of directness and certainty that characterized everything he did, and Frances said hers with a clarity and steadiness that was entirely her own, and when he put the ring on her finger for the second time in as many months, she pressed her fingers over his for a moment after, brief and firm and full of meaning. Calico Creek celebrated with a reception in the street outside the church, which was the logical continuation of the tradition of celebrating important things where everyone could participate. There was food contributed by a dozen households, and music provided by 2 fiddle players and a man named Gus who played the harmonica with astonishing competence, and dancing that started restrained and became gradually less so as the afternoon wore on, which is the natural trajectory of dancing at a wedding in a cattle town in June. Frances danced with Milton for the first song, which was slow and close, and he was a better dancer than she had expected, which she told him, and he said he had learned out of necessity at a social in his youth and had never quite managed to forget it. She danced with Jacob Reeves, who held her hands very properly and said, in the careful way of a man not accustomed to speeches, "Eleanor would have loved you. She would have said you were exactly right for him, and she would have been correct." Frances held onto her composure by a very narrow margin and thanked him in a voice that was mostly steady. She danced with Thomas, who came up to her elbow and steered with great seriousness and no particular skill, and with Ida, who had decided that dancing was a worthy activity and applied herself to it with her characteristic intensity, and with Garrett Holt, who was a fine dancer for a mayor, and who told her that she was the best teacher Calico Creek had ever employed, and that he intended to do whatever was necessary to ensure she remained so, which she thanked him for while being aware that her status was somewhat altered now, being the wife of the largest landowner in 3 counties, which would present its own complexities, and which she would navigate as she always navigated complexity, with her eyes open and her principles intact. At sunset, Milton drove her out to the rocking tee in the buggy, which was decorated with ribbons by persons unknown, but suspected to be Ida and the Hargrove boys. And the ranch house came into view in the golden evening light, looking like what it was: a solid, well-built working place that a man had made from nothing into something. And she looked at it with the particular feeling of a person seeing their home for the first time, the recognition that arrives before the familiarity. The ranch house was larger than she had expected, with a broad porch that looked out over the yard and two big windows in the front that caught the evening light and sent it back warm and golden. He had worked in the weeks before the wedding to make the inside of it ready for her, not in the sense of decorating it, because he was not a man who decorated things, but in the sense of making space in every practical way. Half the wardrobe cleared, a desk set up in the smaller room off the kitchen that had good light and room enough for a woman who would bring her books and her papers and her deliberate daily work to whatever house she occupied. She saw the desk first and stopped and looked at it. "I wasn't sure where you prefer it," he said. "I can move it if the light's wrong." "The light is perfect," she said. They settled into the life of the ranch together in the way of two people who have each been managing alone long enough to appreciate what it means to have a partner, which is to say they appreciated it enormously, and also had to negotiate the very specific adjustments that come with sharing a life with another person for the first time. He rose before dawn, which she did not, at least not comfortably, and she stayed up later in the evening reading, which he did not, and these rhythms had to be accommodated. The kitchen required a period of negotiation about whose system for what was most efficient, which they resolved through a combination of rational conversation and the occasional moment of genuine frustration that they both had the sense to address directly rather than letting it compound. She kept teaching. This had been assumed by both of them, which was one of the things she loved about him, that it had never occurred to him to suggest that marriage should end her work, partly because he was a practical man who understood that capable people should do capable things, and partly because he had been watching her with those children for months, and understood that taking that from her would be taking something essential. The ride into town and back was 8 miles each way, which in the summer and fall was a manageable thing, and in the deep winter required planning. And Milton organized the planning with a thoroughness that included a covered buggy for bad weather, and an arrangement with Jacob Reeves to accompany her on mornings when the weather made the road uncertain, which Jacob did without complaint, and which Frances accepted without making a fuss, because she was sensible enough to know the difference between unnecessary restriction and practical care. The school year progressed beautifully. Thomas Reeves received a letter in October, addressed to Jacob but meant for Thomas, from the teacher's college contact in Austin, expressing interest in the boy's situation and detailing a path forward that would allow him to continue his education at a higher level when the time came. Jacob read the letter 3 times and then handed it to Thomas, who read it once and then sat very still for a moment, and then looked at Frances with an expression that was too large for his 8-year-old face to contain, which Frances thought was the best moment of her professional life up to that point. The seasons of the first year of their marriage moved through each other the way seasons do when a person is paying attention, not quickly, but with a fullness that made each one present and particular. Summer gave way to fall with its sharp blue skies, and the cattle drive season that took Milton away for 3 weeks in September, which was the first significant time they were apart, and which Frances managed by throwing herself into the school year with doubled energy, and by writing him letters, 2 of which actually reached him through the complicated postal relay of the trail, and which he kept folded in his shirt pocket for the remainder of the drive. When he came back from the drive in early October, trail dusty and tired in the specific way of a man who has been responsible for a large, difficult, important thing for 3 weeks. She was on the porch of the ranch house when he rode up, and the expression on his face when he saw her there was something she tucked away in the same place. She kept the flower note from February and everything else that was worth keeping. He came up the porch steps and kissed her before he said anything, which was new and was everything. October gave way to November, and November to December, and December brought the first Christmas at the rocking tea, which they celebrated with Jacob and Thomas, and with Elias and Clara Croft, who had become close friends in the way of people who have chosen each other's company rather than simply finding themselves in proximity. They had dinner at the large kitchen table with the fire going and the lamp on, and the cold outside making everything inside feel richer and warmer. And after dinner Thomas read aloud from a new book Francis had given him, stumbling over nothing, his voice clear and confident. And the adults sat around the table and listened and felt the specific contentment of people who are exactly where they ought to be. In the new year, which was 1884, Frances discovered that she was expecting, which she determined on a January morning with a combination of mathematical certainty and the kind of bodily awareness that women tend to develop about their own condition. She told Milton that evening, sitting across from him at the kitchen table after supper, and she told him plainly as she told him everything, and watched his face do something she had not seen it do before, a kind of complete, unguarded wonder that made him look younger and older at the same time. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hands in both of his and held them very carefully, as though they had suddenly become the most important things in the room, which in a way they contained. He said, "Are you well?" which was the first and most important thing to him, and she said yes. She felt fine, a little tired but fine, and he said, "Good. That's the most important thing." She taught through the spring with the careful management of a woman who intends to be practical about the situation, and who has the sense to talk to Clara Croft, who was a font of practical information about such matters, and to Dr. Elias Croft, who was supportive and straightforward, and who told her she was in excellent health, and that there was no reason she could not continue teaching until she felt it was time to stop, which she interpreted as permission, and which was exactly how he intended it. She arranged for the fall term to be managed by a woman from the next town over who was a qualified teacher, and who Frances interviewed herself, with the thoroughness that characterized everything she did, because she was not leaving her schoolchildren to someone inadequate just because she was temporarily indisposed. The woman she selected was named Ruth Haverford, and she was competent and warm, and Frances gave her 3 days of orientation that Ruth later described to friends as the most comprehensive handover of any job she had ever received. The baby came in September of 1884, on a night that started slow and ended quickly, as such things sometimes do, with Clara Croft and Milton both present. Clara because she was knowledgeable and steady, and Milton because he was not going to be anywhere else. Full stop, despite Clara's mild suggestion that some men preferred to wait outside. Milton Townsend had built his entire adult life on the conviction that the things that mattered most required your full presence, and he was not going to start making exceptions. The baby was a boy. He was born at 11:30 on a September night with the first cool breath of autumn in the air and the stars out in their extravagant Texas numbers, and he was healthy and loud and perfect. And when Milton held him for the first time, standing in the lamplight in their bedroom with this small, brand-new person in his arms, the expression on his face was something Frances watched from the bed and kept. They named him Henry Jacob Townsend. Henry for Milton's father, Jacob because some things needed to be said without words. Jacob Reeves, when told the middle name, went very quiet for a moment and then said, with gruff and genuine feeling, "Eleanor would have liked that very much." Thomas Reeves, who was now 9 and fully aware of his elevated status as practically the oldest child in this extended family, visited the following Sunday and regarded baby Henry with the serious evaluation of a child deciding whether a new addition is acceptable, and concluded that it was, largely on the grounds that Henry had gripped Thomas's finger and held it with surprising strength, which Thomas interpreted as intelligence, and which may have been correct. Frances was back in the classroom by November, which surprised some people and surprised no one who knew her well. She brought Henry to the schoolroom in a basket for the first 2 weeks, which the children considered a fascinating addition to the school day, and which Henry seemed to regard as adequate entertainment. And then Mrs. Dunmore, who had taken to visiting the ranch on Sundays with the proprietary affection of a woman who considers herself foundational to a couple's happiness, and is not entirely wrong, offered to come and sit with the baby on school days, which she did with a thoroughness and devotion that made Frances feel fortunate in the specific way of a person who has found their community. The years settled into themselves, with the comfortable richness of a life being fully lived. The rocking tea grew steadily under Milton's careful management, expanding its acreage in 1885 with the purchase of an adjacent property, which was a business transaction, but also a culmination of something Milton had been working toward since the beginning. The ranch large enough now to be lasting, to be the kind of thing you could build a family's future on with confidence. Frances taught through all of it, adapting as necessary, always returning, because the classroom was as essential to her as the ranch was to him, and he understood this the way he understood important things, completely and without resentment. There was a period in the spring of 1886 when the town council, under the influence of a new member named Albright who had ideas about the appropriate role of married women, raised the question of whether a wife and mother was the appropriate person to be leading the town's school. Frances appeared before the council and made her argument with a precision and force that left Albright with nothing useful to say and left Garrett Holt, who had never doubted her, with the expression of a man watching something he had hoped would happen exactly the way he hoped. She kept her position. The matter was never raised again. In 1887, Henry was 3 years old and had his father's eyes and his mother's will, which was a combination that Milton described, with a rueful and entirely affectionate humor, as magnificent and occasionally exhausting. He was a child who asked questions without ceasing and who had already learned, through some process that seemed to involve the observation of his mother more than anyone else, that the answer to most questions was findable, which meant he tended to look for it rather than wait to be told. Frances discovered in the late summer of 1887 that a second child was coming. This time the discovery was met with delight rather than wonder, the wonder already known and the delight accordingly richer, and Milton came home from the south pasture on the evening she told him, and stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hand and a smile that was the full smile, the best one, and said, "Good. Henry needs someone to argue with." "He argues with everyone," she said. "He argues with everyone and loses," Milton said. "He needs a worthy opponent." The second child arrived in the spring of 1888, on an April morning when the bluebonnets were out in force across the ranch land, and the air smelled like rain and new grass. It was a girl this time. She was smaller than Henry had been and quieter, with Frances's gray-green eyes and an expression of solemn consideration that she wore from the first day, and that Milton said, with absolute seriousness, made her look like she was already thinking things through. They named her Eleanor Ruth Townsend. Eleanor for Jacob's wife, Ruth for Ruth Haverford, who had become a genuine friend and who had, as it happened, settled in Calico Creek permanently, having married the telegraph operator the previous year, which meant the school now had 2 qualified teachers, which Frances considered one of her best accomplishments. Jacob Reeves, when told the baby's name, sat down. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, in a voice that was entirely composed and also entirely full, "She's going to be remarkable." "They're all remarkable," Thomas said, from the corner where he was reading, which was where Thomas tended to be. Thomas was now 13 and tall, and had recently written an essay for a regional school competition that had placed second in the territory, which Francis had celebrated as though it were first place, and which Thomas had received with the particular expression of someone who takes second place seriously and intends to address the deficit. The letter from the Austin Scholarship Program had come again in the fall of 1887, this time with specific terms and a specific year, 1890, when Thomas would be 15, and the program would take him for an intensive period of study that would eventually lead him, if he continued as he had been going, to any path he chose. Jacob had read this letter and looked out the window of the Townsend kitchen for a long time, and Francis had sat across from him and not rushed the silence, and eventually he had said, "He'll be ready. She made sure of that." "He made sure of that," Francis said. "I just made sure he knew he could." The summer of 1888 was full and warm and good. Henry was 3.5 and Alina was 4 months, and the ranch was thriving, and the school was in the best condition it had been since before the previous teacher had left under mysterious circumstances, which were now known to be rather mundane circumstances involving a disagreement about salary. And Francis had resolved that particular historical ambiguity by negotiating a contract with the town council that she considered fair to all parties. On an evening in August, Milton and Francis sat on the porch of the ranch house after the children were in bed, which was the time that had become theirs in the way of the particular hours that married people carve out of the relentlessness of daily life. The summer air was cooling slightly as the day released its heat, and the stars were coming out in the way they did here, one and then a dozen, and then suddenly all of them at once, and the land was quiet in the large, living way of open country at night. He had his arm around her and she was leaning against his shoulder, and they were not talking, which was one of the things she had come to love most about their shared life, the silences that were full rather than empty, the ease of existing alongside each other without the need to fill every moment with words. "I think about that Tuesday in July sometimes," she said after a while. "Which Tuesday?" he said, though she knew he knew. "The one when I fainted in the street," she said. "I was so mortified." "I know," he said. "You were managing it magnificently, even unconscious," she laughed. "You caught me before I hit the ground." "I did," he said. "I didn't know it was you at the time," she said. "I didn't know anything except that the ground was coming up very fast and then it wasn't. And then you woke up and told me you were aware that you had fainted," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "I was trying to establish that I was a competent person." "You were eating hard tack with your hair falling down," he said. "It was quite effective." She turned her head to look at him. "Were you already interested then?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to every honest question. "I had noticed you when you arrived on the stagecoach," he said, 3 days before. "I noticed the way you looked at the town when you stepped off, like you were already making a plan." "I was," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what I noticed." He paused. "When you fainted, I wasn't thinking about interested or not interested. I was thinking that you needed to be off the ground and in the shade and eating something. And then you woke up and looked at me like I was a puzzle you hadn't decided if you wanted to solve," he said. "And then I was interested." She smiled. "It took you until November to do anything about it." "I was building up to it," he said with great dignity. "You were stalling. I was being thorough." "Milton Townsend," she said with all the affection in the world, "you are the most thorough man I have ever met." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "And you," he said, "are the best thing that has ever happened to this ranch." "The best thing," she said, raising an eyebrow. "The best thing," he confirmed. "The schoolroom a close second." She laughed again, fully, the real laugh, the one that had surprised him twice that first evening at the church social, and he held her closer, and the stars continued their extravagant display above the Texas plain, and the house behind them held their sleeping children, and the land around them was solid and real and theirs, and the ring on her finger caught the starlight the way it always did when she wore it, which was always, and there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left uncertain. nothing left to fear or wait for. In the years that followed, Calico Creek continued to grow and change, as frontier towns do, the railroad finally arriving in 1891 with all the disruption and opportunity that railroads bring, bringing new families and new commerce and the sense of the territory contracting slightly, civilization pressing in on the wild edges, which was both a loss of something and a gain of something else, as most changes are. Thomas Reeves left for Austin in 1890 as planned, and Jacob drove him to the stagecoach and stood watching it go with his hat over his heart, and Frances stood beside him and put her hand on his arm and said nothing, because nothing was the right thing. Thomas wrote letters, long and detailed and full of the particular joy of a young person discovering that the world is enormous and he is equal to it. And Frances read these letters at the kitchen table and kept the ones that were most extraordinary, which was most of them. In 1892, Thomas Reeves came back to Calico Creek for Christmas, which was an event. He was 17 and already taller than his father, and he had the bearing of someone who had been shaped by education into a kind of person that the frontier had not necessarily predicted, but that the frontier had, in its roundabout way, produced. He sat at the Townsend table on Christmas Day and talked with Milton about the territory and the future and the railroad, and with Frances about literature and history and the things he was studying, and he played with Henry, who was 8 now and full of opinions, and he held Eleanor, who was 4 and who regarded Thomas with the solemn evaluation she brought to all new things, and decided, after careful consideration, that she approved. Jacob Reeves sat at the end of the table and watched his son, and his expression was the expression of a man who has seen the thing he worked toward come true, and the fullness of it was quiet and enormous and required nothing more. Henry Townsend, at 8 years old, was everything his parents had hoped, and a few things they had not specifically anticipated. He had his father's physical confidence and his mother's relentless curiosity and a stubbornness that was, as both Milton and Frances privately acknowledged, very much from both of them, which meant it was considerable. He was good with horses, which pleased Milton, and he was a fierce reader, which pleased Frances, and he was possessed of a loyalty toward his little sister that expressed itself in a fierce, competent protectiveness that Eleanor accepted as her due, and would continue to accept throughout their childhood with the serene confidence of a person who knows she is well defended. Eleanor, at 4, was quiet and watchful and understood things before she had the words for them, which is a quality that tends to produce either great wisdom or great frustration, or, in the fortunate cases, both. She loved the horses and she loved the big sky, and she loved to sit in her mother's lap during the evenings on the porch while Frances read, feeling the vibration of her mother's voice through her back, and she had recently decided that she was going to be a teacher, which she announced with the certainty of someone reporting an established fact. Frances had looked at her small daughter when this announcement was made and felt something go through her that was too large and too multiple for a single word, and had said, very simply, "I think you'd be wonderful at it." The schoolroom in Calico Creek entered its second decade with Frances Ford Townsend at its front, and the school had grown with the town, now serving 22 children, and the building had been properly repaired and expanded with new lumber and a second room, and the collection of books on the shelf had become a proper small library, donated over the years by families who understood what it was worth. Frances had, in the decade since her arrival, sent 7 children on to further education, of which Thomas Reeves was the first and the one she was most proud of, though she loved them all and kept track of all of them. She was 35 years old in 1893, and she was in her full power in the way of women who have found the right work and the right life and the right person, and who have had enough time to build it all into something solid. The lines at the corners of her eyes were from squinting in the Texas sun and from laughing, in approximately equal measure, and her hair still fought the pins every morning and still won by midday, and the gray-green of her eyes still changed with the light, darker when she was serious and silver when she laughed, which was often. Milton was 42, and the ranch had made him solid in the way that good work does. The lean efficiency of his younger years settled into a strength that was more comfortable with itself. The iron was still there, but wearing more easily, because a man who is well loved tends to become less rigid about everything except the things that genuinely require rigidity, and Milton had gotten better over the years at knowing the difference. He still rode the fence lines himself, and still drove with Jacob to the market at season's end, and still got up before the sun. But he also sometimes sat on the porch in the late evening for an hour doing nothing except being present in his own life, which was something he had not known how to do at 31, and which he had learned from Francis, who had never been very interested in pretending that the present moment was less than it was. On a warm evening in early fall, 10 years and a few months after Frances Ford had fainted in the middle of Calico Creek's Main Street, she and Milton sat on the porch of the Rocking T Ranch house, as they did most evenings when the weather allowed. Henry was inside at the kitchen table wrestling with a mathematics problem of sufficient complexity that he had been at it for 40 minutes, which was a sign of genuine engagement, because Henry's attention was not easily captured for 40 minutes. Alina was asleep, or should have been, though the occasional soft sound from the direction of her room suggested she was doing the thing she did, which was staying awake reading by the light of a candle she kept hidden under the bed, and which both her parents knew about and had decided, by mutual and unspoken agreement, to continue pretending they did not know about. The land was still. The air smelled of grass and the faint far-off smell of rain that might or might not come. The stars were taking their time arriving, the sky still holding the last of the sunset in the west, a long line of deep orange and rose along the horizon. "Do you remember," Francis said, "what you said to me the first time, after I fainted?" He thought about it. "You fainted at the cowboy's feet and woke up with a ring on her finger," he said, with the dry humor that had always been there under the reserve. "You didn't say that," she said. "I said you fainted," he said, "and that I was aware. I said I was aware. You were very precise about it under the circumstances. I had a reputation to establish." "You established it," he said, "while eating hard tack." She was quiet for a moment, the warm silence of the porch in the evening and the sound of Henry's pencil moving across paper inside. "I think about where I was that summer," she said. "Before Calico Creek, before all of this, I had a plan, but I didn't have a place." "You have a place now," he said. "I have several," she said. "The schoolroom, this porch, this house." She paused. "You." He turned to look at her, and in the last of the evening light his face was open in the way it was with her, the careful reserve of the man the world knew replaced by something that was exclusively hers, that she had earned and that she valued above almost everything else she had been given or had worked for. "You have me," he said, "for whatever it's worth." "It's worth considerably," she said, and meant it with her whole self. Inside, Henry put down his pencil and came to the screen door and said, "I got it," with the satisfaction of someone who has worked for something and arrived at the end of it, which was a thing both his parents recognized and which made them both smile. "Write it down before you lose it," Francis said. "I already did," Henry said, with the slight exasperation of someone whose competence has been momentarily doubted, and went back inside. A small sound from the interior indicated that Alina's candle was still lit. Milton and Francis sat on the porch in the gathering dark, and the stars came out, and the land around them was quiet and real and full of everything that had been built here. The cattle and the fences and the house and the children and the years and the life. And the ring on her finger caught the starlight as it always did, and there was nothing left open, nothing left unfinished, nothing left to resolve. The story of Frances Ford and Milton Townsend was the story of a woman who fainted in the street on a hot July morning in 1882, and woke up to find that the man who caught her was the one she had been building toward her whole life without knowing it. and that the ring he put on her finger in the last light of a May evening was the thing that made everything before it make sense, and that the life they made together in Calico Creek, Texas, on the Rocking T Ranch, with the big sky above them and the land around them and the children growing up in the middle of it all, was the kind of life that could bear the weight of two full, strong, complicated people without bending, because they had built it that way, carefully and honestly, and with the full force of everything they were. And on the porch in the dark, with the stars out in their thousands and the sound of their children inside the house and the warm September air moving through the mesquite, they were exactly where they had been heading all along, and they knew it, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.